People often ask me, Hilbert, why bother studying the Viking Age? Hasn't it all gone now? What relevance does it have for us today? And one answer I sometimes give is, well, we're actually all carrying a piece of the Viking Age with us in our pockets most of the time. That is, if you turn on your phone and turn on Bluetooth, the symbol you have to tap is a rune. The symbol is actually a bind rune, which is a symbol that combines two runic letters together. They're the runes of H and B, which are the initials of Harald Bluetooth, a king of Denmark in the 10th century, which is the reason why Ericsson, a Danish company now part of Sony Ericsson, decided to use his initials in bind rune form as the symbol for this communication network, because it was said that he held these parliaments with his chieftains, possibly an extension of the thing of the Germanic peoples, and in that way communicate with them. And that's why when they decided to use a symbol, they chose that. So in that way, the Viking Age is perhaps closer to us than we think, in the form of this bind rune. And that's what I want to talk about today on the History with Hilbert podcast. I want to look at runes, but also not just runes in general, but rather how they interacted with Roman letters and in which way they influenced one another. Because that's actually another way that for some of us, the Viking Age might still be with us, is how the modern Latin alphabet has been influenced by runes and how the Latin alphabet also influenced runes in the past, as well as some ways in which runes were seen in the past that perhaps aren't as correct or that are still perpetuated a lot of the time. Like, for example, that runes are intrinsically pagan or have a secret, mysterious connection, which is probably not entirely true. But I thought I'd delve into that today on this week's History with Hilbert podcast. So what are runes and where did they come from? Well, runes, as you might expect, are a type of letter, but they're clearly different to the type of letters that a lot of us use every day. So, in a way, runes are definitely connected to the letters that we use, which you can see if you look at certain runic letters like a B or an R. They look very similar to a kind of capital B and R, and we would recognize them straight away. Whereas another rune, like the Othala rune, for example, we clearly don't recognize as being an O. But actually a bit of a misconception with runes is that they correspond to letters, because it's not quite the same. They correspond to sounds rather than letters. Now this might be a little bit hard to get your head around, but it's for an important reason, because we also can trace when languages are changing by looking at runes, because the runes did not stay the same for their entire history. Now, when did runes first come into being? If we look at the Norse mythology, for example, as written in the Edda and other places, we find that there is a strong connection between runes and the Norse god Odin, as he's called in Old Norse, and that he hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and 9 nights. And at the end, he grasped the runes, he found out this writing method and then taught it to people. This is a very interesting story, but if we're looking at historical facts and arguments for where the runes came from, we would be looking at the area that the Romans called Germania. And the Romans will be very important for the story of runes, because it's most likely at some point in the 1st centuries AD that it was Germanic mercenaries working as auxiliaries in the Roman army that first came across Roman writing. Now, Roman writing is, of course, the ancestor of the script that we use in most of the Western countries today. And so it's here that Germanic peoples first encountered writing. Beforehand, they didn't have their own style of writing. But then we ask, if they encountered writing and they saw that it was useful, of course, the army used a lot of writing, as we know. If you go up to Hadrian's Wall, you can find some monuments and stones and things inscribed with which cohorts were legioned there. Of course, if you're in a barracks, then you have lists of things that you need, supplies, soldiers, regiments, all of these kinds of things. That requires writing, and so it was incredibly important. But if that was the first writing that the Germanic peoples interacted with, why didn't they just take over the Roman writing system if they were familiar with it? One theory suggests that while they might have seen Romans writing and seen some of the letter forms, which explains some of the similarities, other forms, like for example G, W, J, and P in the Elder Futhark, which is the first of these runic alphabets that appears, really don't bear any resemblance to Roman ones, while other letters like F and U, they look like a Roman V that's been inverted, while the K sound is probably taken from a Roman C. So maybe they were vaguely aware and familiar with the Roman alphabet, but not entirely, and so they tried to replicate it, but this became imperfect when they went back. Or possibly we can find a clue in the actual name rune, which in its Proto-Germanic form meant something like secret. It's also sometimes related to a word to speak quietly or covertly, like a whisper. And so it might be the case that it was based on a Latin alphabet, but that they purposefully decided to change it so that those who were in the in-group, who knew how to read and to cut runes, could read it, while others couldn't. Although this theory, then again, has influenced a lot of earlier scholarship that really went on this idea that it was secretive and magical and that there was a magic meaning to all the runes. Whereas more recent scholarship has moved away from this idea because a lot of the time, a lot of runic inscriptions are really quite mundane and don't have any kind of ritual purpose. Like, for example, in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, if you climb to the top of one of the pillars, it simply says, Halfdan was here. So basically just graffiti. So they don't always have a magical purpose. But at the same time, if we have a magician in today's world, he will be saying abracadabra, he'd still spell that in Roman letters. Doesn't particularly mean that all Roman letters, if I'm writing a meme, are also magical by the same token. The example that R.I. Page uses is that if an archaeologist from the future were to find one of our bath mats that said bath mat on it, how would he interpret this? And we have to think we know the exact context of this, but a future archaeologist might not. And so we should always keep these things in mind when we're looking at runic inscriptions. And a lot of them from the early period do appear to be very cryptic and in a very strange kind of context that probably made a lot more sense to people who were in that in-group back in the time period. And that's important to remember when it comes to studying runes from this period. But back to the early history of runes. While a lot of parallels can be drawn to Roman letters, I should also make a note that other theories, especially earlier ones, but actually some that have quite good backing, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at various scripts. So this would be the Elder Futhark, if you look that up, as well as, say, the Greek alphabet or the old Etruscan alphabet. There are also parallels between these as well, and this might make up for some of those other runic forms that aren't attested or aren't simply inversions of Roman letters during this time. Now, one early theory was that runes, rather than originating in the kind of deep forests of Germania, where we would imagine they would be originating, actually came from much further in Eastern Europe. Now, there aren't really too many Germanic-speaking peoples in the far east of Europe today, but in the Roman period, a group of people called the Goths, who spoke an old Germanic language, an East Germanic language, which have today gone extinct, they were living in this region. And so this explains why a lot of the really early runic inscribed objects, like one that's found at Pietroasa in Romania, and then also Dalmsdorf in central Germany, and as well as Kaul in Russia, that these are inscribed with runes, possibly because of these early Germanic peoples. And it's also incredibly interesting because this provides us with a source for the language that was being spoken at this point for some of these objects that were inscribed in what we assume is the Gothic language, and that can help us to reconstruct a kind of Proto-Germanic language as well that was being spoken around this time, the ancestor of the modern Germanic languages as we know them today. Other scholars have argued more from a Western perspective and thought that the runic alphabet was first created in Denmark because there are a lot of objects that are found in southern Jutland there, that these were mercenaries returning from Roman service, as we can see in archaeological records like with silver drinking cups and things that are clearly Roman but have been found in Danish contexts, as well as a lot of the pit burials that we find. These whole armies, their equipment have been dumped in bogs, and a lot of the equipment that is found dumped is Roman equipment, although this was obviously far to the north, outside of the borders of Rome at its greatest extent. We don't know how many people could read and understand runes. We know that they were developed probably around the turn of the millennium, because by the time we have the earliest runic inscriptions, the 2nd century AD, we know that there are already a few different ways of writing runes, which makes it likely that it had been around for a little while, that these small variations could have come up from different people writing in them and experimenting with them. So it was probably already at least a century old at this point. But we don't know how many people could actually understand and write in runes. And actually, the Belgian runologist, which is the cool name you get if you decide to study runes, René Desrolets, he did some basic arithmetic. And working on the basis that, say there were only 10 runologists working at any one time in the whole of the Germanic world, and if each one cut only about 10 inscriptions in any one year, then there would be between 100 and 500 AD, which is this early period of runic inscriptions, about 40,000 inscriptions. But how many do we have surviving to us today? We have 80. So the likelihood is, unless a lot of these things were carved on wood, and there is an incredibly strong argument to be made there that the vast majority of runic inscriptions that were made have been lost. But this is going on an assumption that rune carving was happening not very often. So 10 rune carvers and they're doing 10, so that's 100 in a year. That it's not happening particularly often, and we haven't found that many if there was so much going on, because we can assume then that there would be more rune carvers. So it's possible that this was quite a rare thing in the Germanic world. Now, it's found throughout the Germanic world, which kind of counteracts this a little bit, because as I was saying, there are examples from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Poland, from Romania, but of course also more famously in Western Europe, in Denmark, in the Low Countries. You find them in France as well. You find them being shipped off to different parts of the world. There's one in Turkey, as I already mentioned, in the Hagia Sophia. There's runes being carved in Britain and Ireland as well, across the North Atlantic, but that all comes later on. In this early period, it's continental Germanic Europe, and there's not a great deal that has actually survived to us. And that's something important, I think, because a lot of the time today, we tend to think that runes was the alphabet of the Vikings. Whereas actually we don't know how many people could read runes, just as we're not as sure at the same time how many people could read Roman letters. Now, with Roman letters, we have a better understanding, and we think it's more ecclesiastically driven. It's people in monastic communities. It's the higher echelons of society. So would we be thinking of something similar for this Germanic world at the time? Was it just people who were higher up who would be writing things? Or was it something that everyone could do? Was it something that everyone knew? It's just we don't have much surviving to us today because a lot of it was done on wood. As I said, this argument that it was done on wood is a very strong one, and this can be seen in the actual forms of runes themselves. Now, if you look at runes, they're very angular. They're all straight lines pretty much. There are some curved variations and exceptions where forms are more curved, but generally speaking, we're looking at staves, which is the word for the vertical stripes that go down on the rune. It's basically going vertically. And then you have incisions that are most of the time not horizontal but diagonal. And one very good argument for why they are this shape is because if you're cutting into wood, obviously the grain of the wood goes horizontally, so you want to cut vertically where you can see the best marks that are being made into the wood. For several centuries, this was the only form of writing that Germanic peoples had, especially as the Roman Empire retreated across Europe, starting from the 3rd centuries into the 4th and 5th centuries. This was what they could write with. Now, of course, they often also used symbols and other things in Germanic art. Look, for example, at the Gotlandic picture stones that you see and various decorations. So we have to wonder how similar was the practice of writing in runes to the practice of writing Roman letters at this period. Now, they also spread with the Germanic peoples. I already included that they came to Eastern Europe, probably with peoples like the Goths. They may also have entered North Africa with peoples like the Vandals, who were also a Germanic people, potentially into Spain with the Visigoths. But as I said, we have a very poor record of what's left over. We're not sure how representative they are of everything that was being written on runes, or whether it's just the luck of survival that we have certain types. So, for example, obviously metal and stone inscriptions are more likely to survive to us than wooden inscriptions. But at the same time, if something's inscribed on precious metal, that's more likely to be melted down and reused and remade, especially when we consider the bullion economy that was in force for a lot of Germanic peoples. Then it might be that there was lots that was done on gold and silver, but that's all been melted away and changed, and there might have been, and I think the vast majority will have been done on wood, that's obviously lost, and we still do get things on wood. So for example, from after the Viking Age, we get 13th century wooden little sticks, little staves from Bergen in Norway, and these was kind of inscriptions that had things like people's personal names, or how many stockfish people had bought, or Olaf, you're at the pub drunk again, please come home. They're a great read if you get a chance. I'll put a link in the description to some of those so you can have a read of them yourself. So I think these are all important things to keep in mind, but I think now I'm going to sort of look at how runes and Roman letters interacted with one another, because the way that they influence each other I find really very interesting. Now we should probably consider at which point the two scripts met. So I've already said that the start of runes, the birth of runes, comes out of looking at Roman letters and possibly some other alphabets as well, some of the different Latin alphabets, as well as the Greek alphabet and potentially the Etruscan alphabet. There are a few kicking around at this early stage. But one important thing to remember is that one of the earliest places where the two will have interacted was in Anglo-Saxon England. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were peoples who came out of what's now modern-day Denmark, parts of northern Germany, and parts of the northern Netherlands as well, and they went off into England. Now, by this time, we think they were already using runes because, as I said, we have 5th century runic inscriptions on some coins in Frisia, in the area that they were stationed just before they crossed over into England. And it's even possible that the very large group of Germanic mercenaries, many of them who will have been Saxons, Angles, Jutes, Frisi, other groups that were stationed in England on Hadrian's Wall, for example, that they were already using runes at this period. And we know that they were emulating ways in which the Romans used runes. So, for example, one of the earlier finds that we see in England is a really nice inscribed sax, which is the kind of knife that they used. It's what the Saxons are named after. And this is from Sittingbourne, and I have to shout out my good friend May here, who may be listening in, who is a good friend from Cambridge, and she appeared in my Cambridge vlog, but she's also from Sittingbourne, and so finally I can put that place on the map. But really, it's a beautiful seax, and it's got this writing on it. And we know that the Romans did this, that certain Roman bladesmiths, that weapon makers, they would put their initials, or they'd put some kind of mark to say that they had made it so people could see it, a trademark essentially. But we know that Germanic peoples were also doing this and putting these marks on to weapons and onto blades, and also putting sort of protections and charms and things like that on these weapons, because of course they'd want some kind of divine help with them. But as I said earlier, that doesn't necessarily make this a magic script. It was the only script that they had, and so of course they would use the script for blessings, for charms, for curses. It doesn't make the whole script magical and holy at the same time. Of course, in Roman England, as I already said, there is clearly record that things are being written in the Roman script, in the Roman alphabet. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, the troops pull out in the sort of early 5th century, and then with the oncoming of the Anglo-Saxons, and probably just sort of general chaos and crumbling and a social change that was occurring at this period. It's a very complex period and very interesting, and potentially rather different to the kind of black and white Saxon and Britain narrative that is often portrayed in other sources from the period. But if we think it makes sense that this kind of Roman writing was lost in most of Britain, because to write you needed originally papyrus and later parchment, the name from perkament. If you go to Dutch, it's easier to track the root of it because it's from Pergamum in Asia Minor, where they developed this new way that you could produce, it's not paper, but an early form of sheet that you could write on. But for that, you needed to import that. That had to be gotten from reeds, papyrus, for example, in Egypt and Asia Minor and other places like this. You needed ink. You needed somewhere calm to write. You needed places to store scrolls. And when things are on fire and people are moving and becoming migratory, it's not really too easy to do that. So the Roman alphabet disappears from Britain at the time. The Anglo-Saxons come in, and we see runes being written because that they were the Germanic peoples and they wrote in runes. And so we see runes appear. But the Roman alphabet would be back. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were, of course, Germanic pagans when they entered Britain. But that wouldn't always be the case because, of course, Rome continued to be Christian despite being sacked by the Goths and really falling from grace for a lot of the time, which is why this period is often referred to as the Dark Ages. But Christianity continued, and of course the Franks converted to Christianity, and so they had a solid base from where they could move the religion into new areas. And it's with the marriage of King Ethelbert of Kent, which is a kingdom in the very southeast of England that had very strong ties to the Frankish kings at the time. He married the daughter of one of these Frankish kings called Bertha, and she was a Christian, and so it meant that he learned about Christianity and also eventually converted to Christianity when he accepted a papal mission that was led by Augustine to come over. This is called the Augustinian mission into England. I believe it was sent out by Pope Gregory at the time that he wanted to convert the English, and there's all sorts of stories about him being in the marketplace and seeing beautiful kids, and yeah, it's a bit weird. But anyway, that happens, and so we get the introduction of Christianity into Kent. Now, with Christianity, a very fundamental part of Christianity, and from the start, has been writing records, because, of course, to be Christian, you need to read the Bible. And so you have to be able to read, you have to be able to write, or for most people, actually, you don't have to read and write, but you have to be able to understand someone who can read and write so that they can read from the Bible, from the Gospels, the liturgy. It's important for church ceremonies, etc. And in that way, writing comes back, Roman writing, into Anglo-Saxon England, because over the course of the 7th century, all of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would become Christian, often with quite a lot of kicking and screaming along the way, looking at you, Penda. But that occurs, and basically then we get the introduction of the Roman alphabet in an ecclesiastical context. It then comes in as well in a royal context, because the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England occurs very much with royal consent. It was a top-down conversion a lot of the time. Get the kings, then they tell people, you're Christian now, deal with it. And so writing comes back in this way. But runes didn't end at this point. In fact, very interesting things happen with runes, and that's what I'm going to look at now. Now, as I mentioned, runes are probably very purposefully designed in their shape to be inscribed on things, to be carved, and that, we can see that with the very vertical staves, and there aren't too many horizontal lines because that's not great for wood, and there are hardly any variations that have curved lines either, because that's really hard to do properly when you're cutting with a knife or something like that. Now, of course, Roman letters can be inscribed as well. We see this on, for example, Trajan's column, and actually the fancy term for the kind of script that's being used here is Roman square capitals that they were using. Now, most of the time then, runes will appear or inscribed on objects, like later rune stones. We've already talked about the Seax from Sittingbourne. This is inscribed in metal, and about wooden examples like the later ones from Bergen as well. It's also inscribed in bone a lot of the time, so there's a really nice early example from Anglo-Saxon England at Caister by Norwich, which is inscribed on a rhodia bone, and the runic inscription reads Raiban, and we think that means rhodia because it's a rhodia bone. So as I said, there are a lot of very kind of cryptic runic inscriptions, especially from the early period, but it might have just been labeling. It might have been a hunter that said, yes, this is a rhodia, I'm going to label this rhodia. It might have been something as mundane as that, or perhaps it was some spiritual purpose. We're not entirely sure. But basically, that is a general rule of thumb, is that you will find runic inscriptions as inscriptions. They'll be inscribed on things, whereas letters, especially the kind of cursive and minuscule, which is the term that's used for a lot of the time when it's joined up, it's less fancy, whereas you also get the kind of square capitals as you would see inscribed, written on manuscript pages at the time, although it takes a lot longer. It's like typing in all caps versus typing in lowercase, but you see that on manuscript pages a lot of the time too. However, there is overlap in this. Now, one of the places where there's overlap is on coinage, because we find coins from the early Anglo-Saxon period that are inscribed both with runes and with Roman letters. Now, a lot of the time in this early period, the coins aren't particularly regulated. Now, one example is from the Frisian town of Harlingen, which is in the modern province of Friesland in the Netherlands, where a solid gold coin, I believe it's there's even an example from the 6th century there, which is inscribed with the runes Hada, Hada, which is most likely a personal name. It's a person's name, so probably the person who minted this coin. And there are other examples as well that parallel this from Kent. So we also see runes being written by Padda, who is another person from Kent, as well as several other names. Though what's interesting is, at the same time in Kent, there's another moneyer who is minting these coins, who is writing his name, but with Roman letters rather than in runes. So it's possible to use both. So it might simply have been the case of personal preference. When I was excavating at the monastic site of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast last summer, one of the coins that we found was a Northumbrian stucca, which is worth hardly anything. They're mostly made of brass, and that had runes on it as well. I believe it was one from King Eanred's reign, which is from the very start of the 9th century, so that's moving forward a little bit more. Whereas in Scandinavia, you find coins where coinage takes off much later than in Anglo-Saxon England, from even the reign of Sven Estridsson, who was king of Denmark from 1047. He mints runes on his coins. So it continues quite a way, and so even though by that time they were also familiar with Roman letters, and you see it a lot more commonly that Roman letters are used on coinages, they could also use runes, and they are also using runes for coins at this period and in various places at different times. Now, Northumbria has a very interesting relationship with runes, as I'll explore, and in quite an ecclesiastical context. So maybe Northumbria is a bit of a special one that you find such a late runic coin for Northumbria, whereas in Scandinavia, as I said, their sort of boom for runic inscriptions comes later on than the ones that we see in a lot of continental Europe and in Anglo-Saxon England. In fact, it's when they're going out of fashion in Anglo-Saxon England that in sort of the 11th century that we see a real boom in that they're being used in Scandinavia, which is interesting when we consider how runes were considered by people at the time of perhaps being a Germanic writing system for Germanic languages, because it's based on the phonology there, which is why you have special characters. And actually these special characters enter into Roman writing as well, because when peoples in Anglo-Saxon England were writing down in the vernacular, in the Old English language, of course, the Roman alphabet had been designed for the Latin language, or for an older form of Latin. And so because there are really quite different sounds in Old English, because it was from a different language family to Latin, it meant that when people started to try and write down Old English with the Roman alphabet, they had to make some changes because not all the sounds they needed were there. Now, where did they turn to get these new sounds and these new symbols? Well, they turned to the runic alphabet. And this is where we see certain new characters, new letters being added to the Roman alphabet from the runic alphabet. Now, the main examples for this, there are three main examples. The first is the letter thorn, which you might think, hold on a minute, A, B, C, D, where does thorn come into that? Well, it's no longer a letter that's used in modern English. Instead, we use the T and the H together to make this sound, just like in Thursday. Now, in Old English, this would have been Thunresday, but it would have been written with the thorn. Now, interestingly enough, in Northumbria, the scribes thought, actually, we are going to write this with a TH and disregard the thorn entirely, which is interesting. But as I said, Northumbria always doing its own thing. But that's one of the examples that you have the thorn. And actually today, thorn and another of the letters, the ev, which looks just like a D, but instead of having a straight back, it has a diagonal back and a line going through it. These sounds are still found, or these letters are still found rather, in Icelandic. The sounds are also still found in English, except we use a TH for both of these sounds and no longer distinguish them with separate letters. So the thorn sound is in the word thorn, whereas the eth sound you might find in the. It's the difference of voicing and unvoicing. In the, there's voicing going on, whereas in thick, there isn't voicing going on. And so they were aware of these sounds, and because it was an important sound already in Proto-Germanic, that's why there were runic symbols for this. Although actually for the ev, they are just using the thorn again. But there is also a distinction that comes when they are transmitting these Germanic languages into a written form in the Roman alphabet when they're writing it down on the manuscript page. The final letter that comes in from a runic alphabet is the win, which again is no longer a letter that's used in modern English, but actually it looks just like a P, and so it's quite confusing for beginner rune learners. They see this and think, aha, it's a P, but actually it's a W. And this also comes in the manuscript tradition, and the win is just the sound, as you might have guessed, is also just a w sound that you see a lot of the time. So if you're reading manuscripts and you see a kind of P that isn't entirely closed, then it's a win sound. It'll be a W. It's quite a useful one to remember. But it also goes the other way. Now, as I said, Roman alphabets were important for creating the runes. They simply stole some of the letter forms and others they inverted and were inspired by. But actually, runes changed because of the ability to write in the Roman alphabet. And this occurred in Anglo-Saxon England, and what's interesting is that we can also parallel this with a place where it didn't occur. Now, of course, manuscript learning and Christianity came to Scandinavia a lot later than it did to England. So if we can compare the different runic alphabets that are being written, we can see some key differences. Now, first, let's define let's call it the first runic alphabet. And even here, there are some problems. Now, I've been using the words alphabet and script, and there is probably quite an important difference to be made between them. Not actually, probably there is, but I've kind of blurred the lines between them until now. Now, an alphabet is like the Latin alphabet, so the one in which I'll be writing the description. That doesn't necessarily translate to the language that I'm speaking, because I could write in English in the Cyrillic alphabet, for example. And I talked about this in my video about the Mongolian alphabet and why they're changing from the Cyrillic alphabet to write in the Mongolian language to the traditional Mongol script or the traditional Mongol alphabet to write the Mongolian language. Now, in the same way, I could write the entire description in runes and then still be speaking in modern English, but it would just be the alphabet that has changed rather than the language. Now, where does script come into this? It's a bit harder to explain today than it would have been 1,000 years ago during the Anglo-Saxon period, or even 100 years ago before computers were quite popular. But a good example would be if I was to write something in a notebook, the script there would be quite different if I was to type an email to someone, even though it's the same alphabet. My letter forms are not going to be let's call them the perfect letter forms that I would type on a computer. You can see it in a way as a font, but of course this wasn't being done on computers and sending emails. This was being done on a manuscript page in terms of the Roman alphabet. So you can have different scripts of the Roman alphabet, and there were a lot of them back in the period. In fact, that's something that I spent most of this year and last year studying a lot of. Now, the same is true for the runic alphabet, because, you can also find distinctions in Cyrillic when Cyrillic is typed versus cursive Cyrillic. And if you ever looked at Cyrillic, cursive Cyrillic can be incredibly difficult to read. There's also a Gothic script, which is of the Roman alphabet, which is incredibly difficult to read, that was popularized and used in Germany for a long time. Found some records from my granddad in that script the other day, and it's, again, very difficult to read. Same alphabet, but different script. It's very, very hard. But you can also do the same with runic alphabets. And so you see a lot of the time that there are slight distinctions. And that's why I said, while most of the time the lines, you don't really find curved ones, there are some examples where you do see more curved lines in particular renditions. Because a lot of the time as well, while there are words that are made in different languages when writing in runes, sometimes they do just write out the alphabet in runes. And that's very useful because then we can compare them and differences and group them and things like this. But the fancy name for the alphabet, because obviously alphabet, it comes from alpha and beta, which are the first two letters in the Greek alphabet. The fancy term for the alphabet that's being used with runes is Futhark. And it's not just a funky word, there is a meaning behind it as well, because these are the first 6 characters that we see. Most of the time, scholars of the runes in the various alphabets will call these different runic alphabets or different runic futharks because they are all different and have different letter forms in them. Now, the distinction between script and alphabet can get a little bit different because they all share features as well, but they also all have their own special characters. And the distinction that is made is between the Elder Futhark, which is what I was talking about in the beginning of the video, this earliest, oldest form that was being written in various places in Germanic and continental Europe and in Scandinavia up until about 700 AD. Now, the next group is called the Younger Futhark, which we can, imagine is the continuation of the Elder Futhark in Scandinavia, and this change occurs around 700 AD. Whereas the final one is called the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc, and it's often spelt with an O, that's why the Futhorc, and with a C rather than a K. And this is quite a good way into what I want to talk about in this next part of the podcast here, because it is in many ways emblematic of how the script developed and changed, and I should say alphabet there, how the alphabet developed and changed from the Elder Futhark, which is the first one that appeared and that we see that has recordings in sort of Proto-Norse languages and Proto-Germanic and things like this, to these other ones that are recorded in languages like Proto-Frisian and Old English in the case of the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc, and then Old Norse in the case of the Younger Futhark. So what's behind the difference in the names of these various runic alphabets? So let's take the names Futhark and Futhorc as a jumping off point here, because it's in this most noticeable, the difference between the Futhark and the Futhorc, that we can see what has changed. Because of course, while Proto-Germanic was the language that was largely being recorded by the Elder Futhark, that meant that when the sounds changed as they did to create the ancestors of the more modern languages, so specifically Old English and Old Norse and Proto-Frisian, then we also have to look at how the sounds that were represented by the runes, because as I said, they don't really correspond as much to letters as they do to sounds, how when those sounds changed into the different languages, how then the runic alphabet changed to accommodate that, because it was based on the sound that was being used. And so if we look at the A rune, now in the reconstructed Proto-Germanic name, this would be something like Ansus. Now this developed in Proto-Norse and then into Old Norse to something that was like os. It was a very nasal sound, so you can see the contraction, the nasal of Ansus is being lost and going into os, and then eventually it became os, as you can see, for example, in Osatru, that kind of sound that was being used. Now, the problem is that at the same time in Old English, or developing into Old English from the languages that had come before it, and actually probably before it had become Old English, so we're looking at a time when we're speaking about North Sea Germanic. So people ask me a lot of the time, Hilbert, what's the difference between Old Saxon, Old Jutish, Old English, the kind of Proto-Frisian that was being spoken at the time? And the answer is we don't really know, because we don't have enough inscriptions and things that have been left over from the period when they were separating out. But there was a period when these would all be incredibly similar. And so this is the kind of time we're speaking about, the North Sea Germanic, the ancestor of Old English before they started to change. And it's during this time that new symbols appear. That is why there is this distinction between the runic alphabet being written in Scandinavia that corresponded with, or actually didn't correspond with, sound changes, and the ones that are being used in Frisia and in Anglo-Saxon England and elsewhere that corresponded with sound changes to do with Old English. And I'm going to talk about those in just a second, but first I'd like to nerd out about this, because I often get asked sort of, Hilbert, why are English and Frisian the closest languages? I can't understand Frisian apart from a few fancy words. Well, a lot of it is because of sound changes that occur, and this is one of the reasons why English and Frisian in that aspect of things are closer than with other languages like Dutch or German, for example. And it's got a very fancy name. This sound change process is called the Ingvaeonic nasal spirant law. And this sounds very scary and complicated, and the fancy lingo that's used to describe it is basically when you have a sequence of a vowel plus a nasal consonant and then a fricative consonant. So these are all just really fancy terms that are used. So actually it's if you've got a combination of letters like N, thorn, so or or uns. So obviously that's the one that's found in Ansus, which is why this sound change applies here. Then basically the nasal disappears, so the N or the M, that's the nasal because it uses the nose to say it, that disappears, but the vowel before it is lengthened as a result of this, because you can't just go around changing words. These things take time. Now this is kind of abstract and complicated, but when you see it in practice, you'll understand what I mean. Now let's compare, for example, the word hour in Old English. Now, in Old English, the word hour was us. Now, that's the same as the modern Frisian word us, whereas this change hasn't occurred in German, where you have uns, or in Dutch, where you have ons. So you can see those two have not been affected by the Ingvaeonic nasal spirant law because they still have the N, whereas Old English and Frisian still today, they have been, because this vowel has got longer, the N has disappeared. And this occurs in a lot of different places. Take the word goose, for example. That's a lengthened vowel, goose. In Frisian, goose. In German, ganz. In Dutch, gans. However, what's interesting is that Dutch actually doesn't play by the rules particularly, because if we compare the word five, again, in English you've got five, the I is a lengthened vowel. In Frisian you've got vijf. However, in Dutch you have vijf. So that has occurred. If it hadn't occurred, the Dutch word would be something like vinf. But it's vijf, whereas in German, of course, it's fünf. It has not occurred in German there. And that's because Dutch kind of broke the rules and is semi-weird and complicated in that case. It's very interesting, but I'm not going to get into that further. But essentially, that's the Ingvaeonic nasal spirant law. And this is one of the sound change laws that slowly occur over time to affect languages, which is also affected in the runes. And I'm going to sort of circle back to that now for the viewers, or I should say listeners. This is a podcast that are listening in for the runic talk. The result of this sound change law is that answers from Proto-Germanic becomes os in Old English. And for this reason, if it followed the same model as what occurred with Proto-Norse, we would then expect that the sound being associated with this new runic symbol os would take the value of the o sound. But this doesn't happen, unlike in Scandinavia. What's very interesting about the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc, and that again is why we have the Futhorc rather than the Futhark, as you see in the Younger Futhark. The reason this doesn't happen is because Old English had developed to have more vowel sounds. It needed more sounds because there were more distinctions to be made than the simpler Proto-Germanic in terms of the variety of vowel sounds that you had. Now, in other contexts, the vowel a came to be pronounced further forward in the mouth, or I should say the vowel a. Now, is not a sound that's used particularly much in English today, but it's found in words like the German Nacht, or, the Dutch Nacht as well. And you had both of these sounds in Old English, because now in modern English we have more sounds that sound like the A is pronounced as in hat. Now, this sound is closer to an E, and this is why I always laugh at my parents when they speak English. I'm sorry, Mum and Dad. But I always laugh because Dutch people don't have this kind of middle A sound that's further forward in the mouth, whereas that's the standard English A sound. And so when they have to pronounce this sound, they overcompensate and go right the way forward. And that's why a lot of the time when you'll hear Dutch people speaking English with a Dutch accent, they'll be saying like, my het. It sounds like they're saying it with an E if you're writing it phonologically in that way, because the Dutch A is way further back in the mouth. And if they say hot, it doesn't sound like hat at all, whereas you've got to find that sweet spot in the middle, and that's very elusive. So I ate an apple. You'll hear Dutch people say a lot of the time. In Dutch, it's appel, further back in the throat, whereas in English, it stops off in the middle. It's not quite the but it's a. And that's why we find, lo and behold, in the Roman alphabet, and I'm always asked, Hilbert, how do you pronounce the weird A and E thing? That's why it's between an A and an E, because it's between the sounds of the A and the E. And it's called an ash, by the way. That is also the name for the rune. And that's an extra rune, a new rune that comes in the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc that we find. So you have the O, which is from the initial answers that has become O to represent the O sound. And you also have the A, which is for the ash sound, which is called ash. But you also still had in Old English that sound, the Dutch or the German sound, which is further back in the throat. And so there were three symbols for what had initially been one symbol, because there were new sounds that had occurred. And what's very interesting is that Scandinavian runologists, they weren't doing this. There were new sounds in Old Norse. They were developing new vowel sounds too, different to the ones occurring in Old English and in Proto-Frisian. And I'm using Old English as the example because we have much more of that than Proto-Frisian. But it doesn't happen the same way. We don't get extra vowel runes being added in the Younger Futhark. The name of the rune to represent the A sound is ark, which is the ancestor of the modern word oak in English, which, again, a lot of them are natural kind of things like thorn and oak and ox, things like this. So they can sometimes be used in that meaning. So there's an Anglo-Saxon rune poem and in the husband's message, which are written in manuscripts. So this is one of the interesting exceptions where we do find runes being recorded in manuscripts. The clues to them lie in what the name of the rune is. So for example, like thorn or like ark and things like this, or soul in the Younger Futhark, son, that kind of thing. Now what's very interesting is that because of these sound changes that occur, and because the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc did add new sounds, they actually end up having more runic symbols. So as I said, there are 2 new symbols that emerge because of the 3 different sounds that the R of Proto-Germanic split into in the Anglo-Frisian languages. And so from the 24 runic letters that we find in the Elder Futhark, there are 26 in the most commonly attested Anglo-Frisian Futhorc texts, whereas in the case of Younger Futhark, so the one that's being written by Scandinavians in the Viking Age, they actually get less letters and not more. They actually go back down to 16. And you might be thinking, well, has Old Norse just become, a lot simpler and they just need fewer letters? They just decided to do away with them? Actually, quite the opposite. They were getting more distinction, but they decided for whatever reason to include fewer letters in it, even though they actually needed the other letters, or we might perceive them to have needed the other letters in this alphabet so that they could write the language phonetically as it was meant to be, because actually it keeps runologists guessing quite a lot of today, because we have to infer a lot of the time which vowel is indicated. And even with the consonants, the Tiwaz rune is often used for a T and a D, whereas in the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc, that's not an issue because there's a separate rune that's used for D and a separate rune that's used for T. So the key question that we all should be asking now is, why did these changes occur in the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc? Why did they start to write, the different sounds that were being developed in the language? How come they were aware of sound changes that were going on in their language and therefore coming up with new characters to better write that down? Why did that happen there in England and in Frisia, but not in Scandinavia with the Younger Futhark, and how come they needed fewer letters? Well, I'll quickly first address the second kind of question there, and that is that while we today would think if we decided to get rid of 8 letters or 6 letters in the alphabet, that would, end quite badly. Possibly you could get away with getting rid of Z and just say, well, you have to, depends on the context of when you put S, or you might decide to get rid of N and M. They're kind of similar. You can probably deal without them. Q can be K and W together, I guess. So you can get round it. What that would mean is that kids have to learn fewer spellings. And that might actually be quite useful, especially if, as I addressed right at the start of this podcast, that we don't actually know how many people could write in runes and learn to write in runes. So it would make it easier, and it would mean that more people could actually understand what was written if there were fewer symbols, because they'd have to learn fewer symbols. And actually, if you get used to writing runes, this is the case for a lot of secretaries, they write shorthand, well, that might be what's going on. They decided that actually accessibility and being able to write quickly as well and memorize fewer letter forms might actually be more advantageous than being clearer in what was being written. Possibly it even goes back to the whole name of rune being secret, that it's something secretive and therefore it's for the in-group to know. And so, having fewer characteristics and having a lot of ambiguity, that's something the Germanic peoples absolutely loved. Things having multiple meanings, ambiguity, riddles are a good example of that, as are kennings that appear. So that might be one of the answers to why there are fewer runes being written in the Younger Futhark period in the Viking Age. Perhaps more people were learning to write in runes. Maybe there'd been some kind of social shift that might even play in with the whole changes that led to the Viking Age. That would be a very interesting theory to pursue if anyone's looking for a dissertation to write. But then, why didn't they do this in Anglo-Saxon England, and how come they were more aware and thought it was more important to document the sound change that was going on in Old English? Well, I think the answer lies in the fact that by this time, when these changes were occurring, the English were already writing in Roman letters. And so because they were already doing this, and I've already discussed how they took runic forms to write these sounds that didn't appear in Latin, so the w, the, and the th, that perhaps as well they were aware that actually it's quite useful to write down the exact sound that you're making, whether that's in the Roman alphabet or in the runic alphabet. And as I said, with the coins, you see that the two often work in tandem. Now, a few more examples, and I think they're all going to be Northumbrian examples. One is the Ruddle cross, which today is in Dumfries and Galloway, and there's a copy of it in London as well. Now, that is a cross from the I think it's the late 7th century. At that time, that area was under the influence of Northumbria, despite being in Scotland. And it's a cross with parts of The Dream of the Rood, which is a poem I discussed it. I actually have a video about The Dream of the Rood. I'll link it below for anyone interested, which is about the crucifixion of Christ. But that's written partially in runes as well. But there's also part of a gospel that's carved in Latin, in Roman letters. And a lot of the time, as I said, because the runes were designed to write a Germanic language in, it's only Germanic languages that we find in runes. But for one example, and that example is on the Frank's casket, which is made of whale bone, so the bone of a whale rather than baleen, which is often called whale bone as one word. It's a bit confusing. But that's from, I believe it's early 8th century Northumbria, and it tells the story of Welland the smith, Vorlund in Old Norse. And that's obviously kind of a pagan story, but it's from the Christian period already. It also has the adoration of the Magi, so the story from obviously from the Bible and things like this on there as well. So it's a very interesting blend of cultures and periods. But for the purposes of this podcast, what's particularly interesting is that this story of Welland the Smith is written in the Old English language and in the runic alphabet. However, when it switches over to the adoration of the Magi, it goes into the Latin language, and as we would expect, it goes into the Roman alphabet. So I hope you're with me so far, because it's about to get mind-boggling, because it then switches back into the runic alphabet but continues to write in Latin, which is incredibly interesting because it's outside of names, it's the only time that we see runes being used to write a non-Germanic language. Now, I said outside of names because there's another Northumbrian example, which is on the coffin of St. Cuthbert, who was reinterred, actually, I believe, in 698. So we're talking the end of the 7th century. And on his coffin, and this is why I said right at the start, The Dream of the Rood, it's a cross. Come on, it's Christian. The adoration of the Magi, clearly Christian imagery. So there's not some kind of pagan runic conspiracy. And I haven't even got on to Scandinavian rune stones at this point yet. But on this coffin, you have the names of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are all bar one, which is kind of interesting, written in runes. And the one that's not written in runes is Luke. For whatever reason, they decided to write Luke, Lucas in Latin, in the Roman alphabet and not in the runic alphabet. And why they did this, I am not sure at all. It seems very random that they wrote the other three in runes, but that one in Roman, in the Roman alphabet. But essentially, that just goes to show that there is a lot we don't know, and there's a lot still to be guessed at. But the relationship between Roman letters and runic letters, it goes right back to the start, and even at this late date, we see this interaction between the two. So to wrap this up a little bit, because we find so many runes being carved in fairly Christian contexts, especially in the case of Northumbria, there probably is a connection between the church and writing in runes, or rather the church and writing in general. It might even be the case that people who could carve runes were also people who were responsible for carving in the Roman alphabet as well, because that also occurs during this period, sometimes, in very close connection with runic carvings as well. If you look at certain inscriptions like the Whitby Comb, where some of the words are written in runes and others are written in Roman script, which again corresponds to the language, which is almost always the rule of thumb, apart from the exception of the Frank's casket that I mentioned. And because it's in these ecclesiastical centres that most likely everything, and if not the vast majority of writing in manuscripts Of course, Northumbria, incredibly famous for its late 7th century, early 8th century manuscripts and writers such as Bede and beautiful gospel books like the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Durham Gospels, and possibly things like the Book of Kells and Book of Durrow as well. Well, we know there was a lot of writing going on at the time. So it's quite possible that there was a very close relationship between the people who were writing on the manuscript page and people who were carving runes. And this is probably why we see that if they were writing things in Old English, they were probably... we don't see much manuscript writing in Old English in the early period. That really kicks off under Alfred because, writing really takes a hit with the Vikings, and potentially before that already with the Great Heathen Army. So Alfred says, okay, we need to go back to basics, and starts writing things in English, which is when you get a lot of the vernacular tradition. But even before that, we can be fairly certain people were writing less fancy things in the vernacular in Old English because it was their first language. And so that's probably why we find that the rune carvers of Anglo-Saxon England at this time also developed new runic symbols as they were developing new letters to write in the vernacular and Old English in their manuscripts. And that's why we see these new forms of runes appearing here, whereas in Scandinavia there wasn't that tradition of Christianity and ecclesiastical foundations that were writing manuscripts and gospel books and etc. So yeah, that's basically the best working theory as to why these differences occur, because of the sound change and because of writing. And that's just a very interesting thing to me, because a lot of the time in popular culture, runes are seen as mysterious, pagan, Germanic, dark, magic. But, their actual history is equally interesting to me. And I think it's very interesting to look at that connection with the Roman alphabet and how actually the runes influence the Roman alphabet as well. To circle right back to the start of the video where I mentioned the HB bind rune, which is this term that's used for two runes that are put together, because actually, with the stave system, it saves carving, especially if you're carving into stone. It saves carving another stave, so that's why you've got the H on the left-hand side, and then, the B is very recognizable because, as I said, it's one of the forms that was pretty much lifted from Latin into the Elder Futhark. But to go back to that might even be, it's very possible that it's just for convenience sake, because it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you've got the same stave, you can cut down on the work by simply using that stave as the stave for the next rune along. But it might come from a tradition of something similar that occurs in manuscript writing, which is a ligature. And so actually the ash is a ligature. It's a combination of two letters together. So that's a combination of the A and the E. But you see it a lot of the time in manuscript writing because it was very laborious work. Today we just kind of scribble things on paper. But back then you had to follow very precise letter forms and making everything perfect and neat in different scripts. Especially if it was a higher class manuscript, then that was very important. And so a lot of the time what they'd do is they'd have ligatures and abbreviations for things. So a very famous one is a ligature of E and T, because in Latin et is and so it appears an awful lot, and you often see quite tall ligatures of E and T as well as other things together there. So it's possible that came from a manuscript tradition and was brought into the rune carving tradition, but it's also equally possible that was just because a wise guy thought, actually, I'm going to cut down on time and not bother to do that. Alright, so I think that's all I want to say about runes and Roman letters today. I've been going for almost an hour, and I think it's a good time to stop there and let it marinate in your brain for any of you who are still listening. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this one. People have asked me to go more in depth in topics, and I hope I've done this here with the runes. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about runes. I haven't even touched on Scandinavian runestones, which is a whole new field in itself, and barely scratched the surface, if you forgive the pun, on a lot of runic topics, but I'll look back into it. I'm going to have some guests on here as well. I've had some responses from some awesome people, some historians, some archaeologists, and hopefully I'll get some linguists and potentially even some runologists on here as well. I do actually know a couple of them, so just let me know in the comments below. Please share this around. That would really help me out. Give me a like and a comment for the algorithm so it gets boosted. And thank you so much for tuning in. I have been Hilbert. This has been the History with Hilbert podcast. And until next time, on Chien.